If you recall last week, we talked about history in general. We talked about the scope of what we're going to discuss in the coming month. And I told you that there's going to be times when we're talking about secular history as opposed to church history. And my point I made was that those events in secular history are setting the table for what's going on in church history. So last week we looked at Alexandria and Alexander the Great. And we're going to start with the Roman Empire this morning. So they brought political unity to the Mediterranean world, but they still let everybody keep their ancient laws and their customs. Now, the Romans wanted as much uniformity as possible without causing unrest among the populations they ruled. And in that sense, they were like Alexander the Great. They were trying to have a one-world government where everybody lived in harmony, but yet kept their local customs, which is not something that, in my mind, seems possible. Of course, we know that the Romans built roads to move the armies, and some of those roads are still in existence today. Some of them are actually used today. We can't get a pothole fixed, but the Roman roads have been around for several thousand years, right? Most of the travel took place on the ocean, right? Because after a while, the Romans owned all the land, as it were, on both sides of the Mediterranean. They also had gotten rid of the pirate problem, so it was faster to travel by sea as long as the weather cooperated. And we saw that in the epistles of Paul, right? He talks about being shipwrecked, and there's great discussion in Acts about them being shipwrecked on Malta. But the Roman Empire obviously was not all good, but it brought along with it two threats to early Christians, and that's syncretism and emperor worship. So what's syncretism? The Romans believed that their subjects had different gods. They were all ultimately the same God. Sounds familiar? Yes, right? Ecclesiastes 1, verses 9 to 10 says, "What exists now is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing truly new on earth." Is there anything about which someone can say, look at this, it is new? It's already been done long ago before our time. So what we see today in our culture with all roads lead to God, not anything new than it was in the Roman Empire. However, this attitude allowed the Romans to see the Jews and the Christians as unbending fanatics who insisted on sole worship of their God. That's no different anymore either, right? How dare you be so exclusive? Mystery religions grew up among the Romans, and those were religions that required an initiation and were not necessarily the religion of any given Roman was raised with, based on their city of origin. Right? You see in the epistles, that when he's in Ephesus, right? Great is Artemis of the Ephesians, right? Every city had their own gods. But these mystery religions were religions of personal choice, and they were based on myths regarding the origin of the world, the sustenance of life, and the life of the deity. And then there was emperor worship. And we're familiar with this issue because it's mentioned in the scriptures. Now, emperors were originally deified upon their death. That started with Julius Caesar and Augustus. But over time, the emperors demanded deification while they were still alive. Why would you want to do that? Because you become an absolute dictator in that situation. And this required the citizens to offer incense to the emperor, pour out wine, libations to him. And when the Christians refused to do this, it was viewed as treasonous and seditious. The Roman Empire had two philosophic traditions that were actually attractive and helpful to early Christians. We're talking about early Christians. Doesn't mean this is necessarily correct, but we're talking about early Christianity. The first one was Plato. And everybody knows Plato, not Play-Doh, was Socrates' student, and they both criticized the ancient gods and taught a supreme being that was perfect and immutable. They also believed in the immortality of the soul. Plato taught that above the world there was a higher world of abiding truth. That's where we get the idea of that's a chair, right? But if I mention chair to somebody in a vacuum, there's a recognition of the idea of chairness, right? Everybody knows without looking at one what a chair is, even though the chairs have different characteristics. And so the early Christians found Plato's theories useful when trying to convert pagans. However, later Christians started using Plato's idea to understand Christianity, and that resulted in bitter theological debates. And we will see that and discuss those. And then the second philosophic tradition that the early Christians saw as a wedge or an entrance was Stoicism. So by the time Christianity comes along, Stoicism had evolved to the point where it had religious overtones. They believed that the purpose of philosophy was to understand the law of nature. To obey and adjust to it. The wise, therefore, are those whose mind is attuned to the universal law that reason prevails. When this happens, passions subside and the philosopher approaches a state of what in Greek is called apatheia, which we get the word apathy from. So they're talking about a philosophy that says, well, you're going to be in a state of serenity, and we call it apatheia. But when we think of apathy, it's like, I just don't care. The virtues that one must cultivate under Stoicism are moral insight, courage, self-control, and justice. This notion of natural law as a guide to wisdom was soon taken up by the early Christian apologists who argued that the Christian life was life according to that law. So do you hear an echo there of natural law? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God. So this is a world of early Christianity which provides both opportunities and pitfalls going forward, as we'll see. So Zeke took us to Acts 7 with the stoning of Stephen and the introduction of Paul. And I always like that last verse because it sounds so cinematic, right? and Saul was guarding the coats of those who stoned Stephen. Right? In Acts chapter 11, we're told, so then those who were scattered because of the persecution that occurred in connection with Stephen made their way to Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews alone. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Greeks also, preaching the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is the spread of the gospel. Why isn't the pointer's not? And Jeek talked about this in his Acts discussion about how it spread out from Jerusalem to all the areas that the people were from. So they dispersed, the Christians dispersed through the empire. And when they did, they went first to the Jews and then to the Greeks, just like we see in the Bible. Paul, when he would go into a city, he'd go to the synagogue first. Synagogue would throw him out, so he'd go to the Gentiles. The mission of Philip in Samaria and the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch is possibly the first indication of the church's willingness to receive non-Jews. And that issue, if you recall, was finally faced when Peter had his interaction with Cornelius and the vision that they both had. So these events show that according to Acts, while the earliest Christian expansion was mostly the result of witness to those Jewish Christians of Hellenistic tendencies who had to flee Jerusalem, the church approved of their work both among the Hellenistic Jews and the Gentiles. Now, these Gentile converts were not completely alien to Judaism. They were what the Jews called God-fearers, people who believed in God and the ethical teaching of Israel, but for one reason or another had not yet joined the ranks of Israel to become proselytes. And the Ethiopian eunuch and Cornelius are such God-fearers. Now, as a man, I can understand why they wouldn't want to join Israel all the way, right? Then we come to Paul's work. And he took the gospel to many places, but to say that he was always the first to do so is an overstatement. And we read in the book of Romans that there was a church in Rome before Paul's arrival. And in Acts, when Paul was being taken to Rome, he arrived at the small seaport of Puteoli, and there were already Christians there. Barnabas and Mark went to Cyprus. The Alexandrian Jew Apollo preached in Ephesus and Corinth. And Paul complained in Corinthians, right, that some preach Christ from envy and rivalry, and yet he rejoices that Christ's being proclaimed. Actually, that's not in Corinthians, it's in Philippians. So the missionary task itself was undertaken by those whose names we know, right? But it was also by countless nameless witnesses who went from place to place, taking with them their faith and their witness. This is a lesson for us. Some of these, like Paul, traveled as missionaries impelled by their faith, but mostly these nameless Christians were merchants and slaves and others who traveled for various reasons, but whose travel provided the opportunity for the expansion of the gospel. And therein lies one of the problems of studying history. And what is that? Well, famous people write history, right? Winston Churchill famously said that he was going to write the definitive history of World War II after it was over, right? because A, he was the winner, and B, he wanted to get everything down so the narrative was set. But what we don't get to see in history is the average daily life of a citizen at whatever time you're talking about. We get some glimpses, right? During the Civil War, a Southern lady by the name of Mary Chestnut kept her diaries during the Civil War. So we have those to show what real life in the Civil War was like. The Library of America put together a 4-volume set of letters from people during the Civil War, organized by each year of the Civil War. And you could probably say that when it comes to the Constitution in the United States, we have John Madison's debates on the Constitution. Those were his notes, but this is a famous guy. We don't know what the average Philadelphian thought about what was going on there. And so that's the trouble with studying history, is you can discuss and talk about the folks who made a major impact in history, but it's hard for us to get to what was really actually going on at the time, right? The best historians will dig up letters and read things that are not available to the general public. And then they start giving you glimpses of it. But it's hard to put together a discussion in detail of what the average people were thinking when things were happening. So the growth of the Gentile church brought about a number of changes, particularly in worship life. When the Christians were expelled from synagogues, they began meeting in private homes for Sunday breaking of bread, but also for instruction and support, and for the task of living as Christians in a hostile world. When most believers were former Jews or God-fearers, it was taken for granted that they already knew the fundamentals of the Christian faith. But as a great number of Gentiles became believers, it became necessary to provide for them more extensive periods of teaching and training before they were admitted to the church by baptism. And thus arose the first catechisms. Right? And the people were called, who were doing that, like we have a new members class, and people were called, I can pronounce this, the catechumenate, the person who's going through catechism. As part of the process, the service became divided into two main parts: service of the word and the service of the table. In the former, extensive portions of Scripture were read and interpreted both as a guide for those who are already baptized and for those who are undergoing catechism instruction. And then those that weren't baptized were dismissed, and the congregation proceeded to the service of the table, communion. And while this process took place in early Christian history, the evidence indicates that it continued for the first 3 centuries. So, what are some of the facts and the legends regarding the apostles? And there's a lot of them surrounding their final days. And some of them are more trustworthy than others. Some are simple local legends that were the result of a particular city wishing to be associated with a given apostle. So our first and most trustworthy tradition is related to Peter. He was in Rome and suffered martyrdom during Nero's persecution. Writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries seem to agree on this. We were also told he was crucified upside down at his request in accordance with the word in John 21:18-19. Now, the Catholic Church says this is the tomb of Peter. I think Peter would be a little taken aback at the ostentatious presentation of his tomb. However, the Catholic Church says, and I quote, "The tomb of St. Peter is located beneath the main altar of the Vatican Basilica. A grave was dug on the southern slopes of the Vatican Hill right in front of the circus that was the scene of the persecutions against the Christians at the time of Nero. It'd be 54 to 68. And on this modest burial site, a century after the apostles' martyrdom, it says a century after the apostles' martyrdom, a small funerary memorial was built. And that was recorded by the priest Gaius at the end of the 2nd century. So how worthy is this information? It's at the end of the 2nd century. So we're talking about the 290s, right? If Peter was martyred in the 50s or 60s, you've got a huge gap there. Now, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea relates, I can show you the trophies of the apostles. Or if you want to go out to the Vatican or on your way to Ostia, you will find there the trophies of those who founded this church. That memorial was generally called the Trophy of Gaius, indicating to early Christians the tomb of Peter, which already before Constantine was the destination of devout pilgrims. Now, before Constantine is what? Constantine became emperor in 330. So we're still a couple centuries out beyond the actual martyrdom. And Constantine said that that was the destination for devout pilgrimages, testified to by numerous Latin graffiti with the name of Christ and Peter carved into a plaster wall near Peter's memorial. Okay, well, when was that carved into the wall? When was it plastered? In particular, on a small fragment of plaster originating from the so-called Red Wall in which the memorial was built, the following Greek letters were engraved. And it basically says, Peter is here. Or again, in the perspective of Peter's presence, Peter in peace. The presence of this burial site unearthed through the famous archaeological explorations of the 20th century, somewhere between 1939 and 1949. What else was going on during that time? 1939, 1949. Determined the birth of the first great Basilica of St. Peter, built upon the tomb of Peter in the 4th century. So we've gone from the 2nd to the 3rd to the 4th century here, by Pope Sylvester and the Emperor Constantine, and subsequently the construction of the new Renaissance Basilica, which took place of the preceding one. That's quoting from the Catholic Church. So that's Peter. Paul's demise is more complex. The book of Acts leaves Peter preaching in Rome, and the ancient writers agree he died there under Nero's persecution, beheaded as a Roman citizen. Others say that he undertook journeys not mentioned in the book of Acts, including a trip to Spain. Now, you remember, he did mention that he wanted to come visit the Romans, and then he wanted to travel on to Spain. But did he get that opportunity or not? We don't know. And some have tried to tie these two traditions together, but there's chronological problems with that. So this is the tomb of Paul. And once again, according to the Catholic Church, in 61 AD, Paul arrived in Rome to undergo judgment. He was beheaded between 65 and 67. His body was buried 2 miles away from the place of his martyrdom in a sepulchre along the Ostian Way, owned by a devout Christian woman named Lucinia, who was part of a pre-existing burial place. Sound familiar? Jesus was in a new tomb and a burial place, right? Even though he was a Christian, it was possible to bury Paul in a Roman necropolis due to his Roman citizenship. Shortly thereafter, his tomb would become a place of worship and veneration. Upon it was erected a memorial where during the first centuries of persecution, many of the faithful pilgrims would go to pray, drawing strength necessary to carry out the work of evangelization of this great missionary. It apparently has a marble tombstone that bears the Latin inscription, Paulo Apostolo Mart, which means Apostle Paul Martyr. Composed of various pieces, and then the one where Paulo is written, there's 3 holes, and it goes on and talks about the largest sarcophagus. And so it's under the altar of confession in the Vatican. And during recent renovations, they put that window in there that you see in the picture, just below the papal altar, in order for the faithful to see Apostle Paul's tomb. Apostle John. This one has a little more. We know the Apostle John was exiled for his faith late in life. We see that in Revelation 1:9. He was on the island of Patmos. And the Bible doesn't give us details about how John died, but tradition gives us a few theories. The most plausible theory of John's death states that John was arrested in Ephesus and faced martyrdom. Is this mic cutting in and out? He faced martyrdom when his enemies threw him in a large basin of boiling oil. Ouch. However, according to the tradition, John was miraculously delivered from death. The authorities then sentenced John to slave labor in the mines of Patmos. On this island, the southern part of the Aegean Sea, John had a vision of Jesus Christ and wrote the book of Revelation. He was later freed, possibly due to old age, and he returned to what is now Turkey. He died as an old man sometime after 98 AD. The only apostle to die peacefully. That's one theory. Another theory concerning John's death, and here we go, the 2nd century bishop named Pappus of Hierapolis. Okay, now we're out in the 2nd century. According to one commentary of this fellow's writings, John was killed by a group of Jewish men. However, many historians believe that this guy was misquoted or misread and doubt the credibility of this theory. And there's also the legend that says that John didn't die, but rather ascended straight into heaven like Enoch and Elijah. No biblical evidence to lend validity to this story. But there is a tomb in Ephesus, and you can go visit it. So late in the 2nd century, churches in every important city began claiming apostolic origins. Now that makes sense if you think about the society at the time, because when they were pagan cities, of course they were never really Christian cities at the time, but as pagan cities, they claimed pagan deities as the city's patron, right? Now, in the 2nd century, we got churches in cities claiming apostolic origin to lend credence to themselves as a church, but it's also got that echo of the pagan culture in it as well. In its rivalry with Rome, the city of Antioch, the church in Alexandria felt the need to have a founder with apostolic connections. So this is Alexandria trying to say, we had an apostle too. And tradition states that Mark founded a church there. He was also martyred in Alexandria in 68 AD. That's a tradition, right? Now, you go to Venice, there's a big old square in the plaza of Venice called St. Mark's Plaza, right? So the Spanish claimed that James visited their country, but this tradition comes from the 5th century, so it's most likely not true. But Spain does claim James as their patron saint to this day. The tradition of Thomas visiting India is well known, and the Acts of Thomas were written as early as the 2nd century, again, when the timing was. But it's embedded with legendary tales to make it highly suspect. It tells of an Indian king and his brother, that his brother died, came back to life, and to confound matters further, archaeologists have found coins that prove there was indeed a king and a brother by the names that are mentioned in this 2nd century writing. Couple this with the fact that Christianity in India goes back to antiquity, and that there's significant trade between India and the Near East at the time, it makes it more difficult to dismiss Thomas as the founder of Christianity in India. Now notice what I said there. Significant trade between India and Near East at the time. So who brought Christianity to India? Was it Thomas? Or was it the merchant traders who were Christians and slaves, people of more common stock visiting India? So in truth, most missionary work was not carried out by apostles, but rather the countless nameless Christians who, for different reasons, persecution, business, or missionary calling, traveled from place to place, taking the news of the gospel with them. And so, we begin to have conflicts with the state of Rome and this new Jewish sect called Christians. Now, the Romans of the 1st century did not view Christianity as a separate religion, but rather a sect within Judaism. In 1st century Judaism, we know, was not a monolithic entity, but contained various sects and opinions. You had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and now you had the Christians. So to the Romans, it's like they're just another set of Jews. And from the perspective of 1st century Jewish Christianity, Christianity was a heresy, and these people were going from town to town trying to convert Jews to this heresy. Furthermore, many of the Jews believed, with some biblical foundation, that the reason they lost their national independence and became subject to the Romans was because the Jews had not been successfully faithful to the traditions of their ancestors. In other words, we weren't Jewish enough. We didn't follow the law enough. In the New Testament, it's the Jews who persecuted the Christians, who then turned to the Roman authorities for protection. Thus, Romans, Jews, and Christians agreed that what was taking place was a conflict among the Jews. As long as the things were relatively orderly, the Romans preferred to stay out of such matters. If there was a riot or disorderly conduct, then the Romans would act. We see an illustration from this in Acts 18. When the Jews were expelled from Rome in 51 AD by Claudius, but the reason isn't stated. Suetonius, a Roman historian, says the Jews were expelled from Rome for their disorderly conduct because of Chrestus. Obviously, Chrestus is a reference to Christus, or the Christ. Most historians agree that what took place was that Christian proclamation in Rome caused so many riots among the Jews, the emperor decided, all of you, out. I'm sick of it. Because to Claudius, they're all the same. They're disturbing the peace. As more Gentiles joined the church, it became clear that the Jews and the Christians were separate matters to the Romans. As Jewish nationalism increased towards AD 70, and the rebellion against Rome, which obviously resulted in the destruction of the temple, the Christians distanced themselves as much as possible from that Jewish nationalism movement. As a result, the Roman authorities realized that Christianity was a religion quite different from Judaism and therefore did not enjoy Judaism's protections. And thus, this is the Roman Empire at its maximum. And I wish this light was, there it is. So you have Rome, we have Antioch down here, Constantinople up here, Alexandria down here. And I thought, how strange. This map doesn't list Jerusalem. That's why I put that circle there where it's empty. Well, that's the maximum of the Roman Empire in AD 100. Jerusalem wasn't there anymore. It was gone in AD 70. And the whole area was renamed by the Roman emperor as Palestinia, hence the name Palestine. So we're going to stop there. And next week, we're going to start talking about persecution. And the first guy we're going to see is the emperor that everybody loved, Nero.